Okay. So I hope it will work now. So this is our next guest speaker, David McKinney. He's based in the UK. We had a bit of actually trouble finding Swiss-based speakers. I don't know why. We really tried to reach out to at least 10, 15 people, I think. Okay, so David McKinney is the co-founder and director of ARMoR, the Alliance for Reducing Microbial Resistance. He has a master's in applied chemistry with chemical engineering, and he has been working for 5 years for AstraZeneca. But then recently, last year, he participated in the Charity Entrepreneurship incubation program. It's from a nonprofit called Ambitious Impact, or AIM. And among other things, they have this really cool incubation program, which is called Charity Entrepreneurship, where they, maybe you will tell us more about it, but basically they incubate new effective charities. And yes, so without further ado, maybe we'll start. Thank you so much for joining us, and the stage is yours.
No problem. Thanks a lot. Great to be here. Thanks for having me, and hope you're having a good conference. Oh, can I share my screen?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
If not, well,
we should have tried it earlier.
no problem.
Okay, it should be okay now. Can you try it again?
Yeah.
Perfect. Make it a little bit. So, okay. Perfect.
So you've basically outlined what my first slide was. But yes, so I actually was very close to doing medicine myself, but then decided to go and do chemistry with chemical engineering at Strathclyde in Glasgow. After that, I went on to work for AstraZeneca for 5 years, where I was an actual chemist for a few years, and then, like a lot of technical people, decided to leave the lab and ended up being a project manager, where I would manage manufacture of clinical trial drugs, which was really cool. And then went from there on to Charity Entrepreneurship, that I'm sure is familiar with some of you. But essentially, they run a program where they take founders and try and pair them with ideas for what they think will be really high impact nonprofits. So you work for them for about 8 weeks to identify which idea you and your co-founder are going to start, and you kind of develop the idea, you learn a bit about how running a charity works, and then you put forward a proposal to their ring of funders, and they hopefully give you some money to get started, which is what happened with us. So we turned 1 year old a couple of weeks ago, which has been a bit scary, but also it's been very exciting. And so from the back of there, I launched ARMoR, which is a policy organization working in antimicrobial resistance. But I'll come a bit more onto that later. But to start today, I'm going to introduce you to another member of my family, my youngest brother. So my youngest brother is currently doing a PhD at Cambridge in AI. So it doesn't get much more effective altruism than that. His particular specialism is the intersection of AI and decision making at the highest level of government. So very sort of EA. But he almost didn't get there. It's not going to take a genius to figure out that this isn't him. This is just a picture that I've used to represent this. But at about 5 years old, he had a really bad bout of sepsis and was in hospital in intensive care for something like 3 weeks. So what I wanted to show here is just sort of how fundamental antibiotics are to absolutely everything we have in modern society. Probably don't need to tell this to a room full of doctors, but wanted to introduce the concept anyway. And then what I'm going to talk a bit about is how policy and making sure that the right policy is in place is absolutely fundamental to making sure that people like my brother and others can be treated in the future. So this is my talk. Too many drugs, not too many bugs, not enough drugs, and an introduction to policy advocacy for high impact. So today I'm going to run through a bit about antimicrobial resistance. You'll have to forgive me if you all already know all of this. Normally, this talk isn't for such a medical audience, but I'll skip through it, and if there is any particular questions you want to come back to, we can do that. Then I'll come on to something that hopefully you're a bit less familiar with, which is the idea of the market failure that stops us getting access to new antimicrobials. We'll discuss a bit about solutions to that market failure and what we're doing at ARMoR. I'll also touch a bit on issues related to global access to antibiotics, antimicrobials, vaccines, and diagnostics for treating bacterial infections. Um, Come on to a bit about what we're doing at ARMoR to try and get around this, and then generally some thoughts on policy as a path to impact. I'll try and spend quite a bit of time there, because I think that's probably what's most interesting, and we can also have a bit of a conversation on how to get started in policy, why I think it's super interesting as an area, why it might suck as an area to work in as well, and sort of explore some of our learnings from there. But coming back to antimicrobials, I just wanted to quickly highlight what I call the unreasonable effectiveness of antimicrobials versus other medical technologies. So I've quickly highlighted what difference they've made to medical technology. So for example, in hospital-acquired pneumonia, they've reduced the death rate by something like 30% since their inception. They've changed the They've changed bacterial endocarditis from being a literal death sentence to something that is treatable in 3 out of 4 cases. Same with blood infections and bacterial meningitis, just ridiculous drops in the mortality rates since the inception of antimicrobials. In fact, some studies estimate that they've extended the average human lifespan by something like 20 years. The estimates vary on that, but it seems to be a minimum of about 10, up to a maximum of about 23, depending on which study you're reading. But it's really only comparable to things like vaccines and the introduction of any sanitation at all. It's probably the only other technologies that could claim to get anything like this. Um, but as medics, I'm sure as you'll all know, we're losing their effectiveness. As we treat microbes, they become resistant to the drugs that we use to treat them, and you end up with a colony of microbes that effectively are very difficult to treat by any of our existing technologies. This currently leads to something like 1.3 million deaths a year directly from that resistance, and it's associated with another 5 million deaths per year. So with that, that gets it to more than malaria and HIV put together. And a very recent study in the Lancet estimated that by 2050, sorry, this was going to get up to about 8 million deaths associated with resistance each year, just in bacterial infections. Obviously, we have resistance to fungal pathogens. We also have resistance to HIV, malaria, other things. So it's a really big problem. This looks like something like $30 billion dollars in healthcare costs added to just in the US every year for treating drug-resistant infections. And by the year 2030, this is a World Bank estimate, we think that it could cost something like $1 trillion to the global economy, which is equivalent to the 2008 financial crash. But maybe most fundamental to this is the loss of the foundation of modern medicine. So, as we know, antimicrobials are foundational to everything we do. We give them prophylactically when we're doing cancer treatments. We give them as a result of something like 1 in 5 surgeries need to lead to giving antimicrobial treatments. So without them, we really just shift the risk profile on absolutely everything we do and mean that we just can't do a vast majority of modern treatments that we currently rely on. Something else I wanted to highlight is this is just it's quite an underexplored area within effective altruist circles. I did a quick review of the forum, and it's something like 1.7% of posts on biosecurity include any reference to antimicrobial resistance. And while I don't think that number should be 50% or higher, I think it probably should be a bit higher than 2%, given what we're looking at. Very quickly talk through this, because again, you probably all have a pretty good idea, but microbes develop resistance in a variety of ways. They can develop new processes to push the antibiotics back out the cell using things called efflux pumps. They can increase their cell wall, which basically means they can't penetrate anymore. Or we can do things like changing the shape of the enzyme that they would usually target in order to make them not effective. I'm a chemist, so as a quick way of talking through how they get over things like penicillins or other beta-lactams, they essentially develop this enzyme called beta-lactamase, which opens up your little beta-lactam ring and effectively renders your antibiotic useless. The main drivers, most people are familiar with a few of these, so overuse and misuse in humans and animals, obviously being a big issue. Manufacturing emissions, so when we make these things, a lot of the time they end up in the environment, and that just creates a hotbed for resistant bacteria. Poor sanitation, particularly in low and middle income countries, can result in just a lot of spread and a lot of passing of these pathogens around, particularly in hospitals. Um, but then one thing that's quite underexplored and we think is more of an issue than people discuss is a lack of access to antibiotics. A lot of people think that it's really just using too many of them, but in a lot of the world, there's just a real lack of access. And this essentially means that physicians will prescribe whatever they have on hand or far too short courses. And if you were trying to generate resistance, this is the way you would do it. You would get people to prescribe drugs that don't quite kill all the bacteria or don't quite treat them, or you get them to prescribe it for too short a period of time. So we really think lack of access is quite underexplored as a driver of antimicrobial resistance. Other factors that are currently exacerbating this as an issue are things like conflict. So there's a lot of studies coming out now about how the war in Ukraine, people are essentially coming out of war zones there and bringing into Europe really highly resistant pathogens. And as we kind of are seeing increased destabilization, obviously the war in the Middle East right now is showing up as a hotbed of infectious disease and AMR. Um, Weak supply chains, so shortages are becoming increasingly common, and this basically means you don't have your first choice drug to treat a lot of infections. And this is even in Europe. It's shocking how many times you can't get access to basic antibiotics in Europe. Happy to come on to that a bit more later if that's of interest. And then there's an increasing body of evidence that's really just emerged over the last few years about how climate change and hotter temperatures and wetter temperatures basically favor the evolution towards resistant bacteria. So a lot of things we're seeing in the world at large have quite a lot of intersectionality with antimicrobial resistance and are generally driving that to be worse. Add into that the fact that it just sort of generally destabilizes healthcare systems, and you end up with a real situation where you're just going to see a lot more of these drug-resistant infections in the wild, and basically just have a lot more resistant infections kicking around, which is negative for everyone. And in an increasingly interconnected world, you're really just one plane ride away from bringing that into other countries where it's less of an issue. Highlighting how bad it is just now, I've semi cherry picked this data, but I really could have chosen a lot of other infections and a lot of other countries to highlight just how bad things are. So resistance of E. coli to cephalosporins, you can see from 2005, where this map looks just not that intimidating, to 2020, where it looks a heck of a lot more scary. And even in countries like the Nordics, you're seeing resistance go from less than 5% to it's sort of in the 10% region. But then in Italy and Eastern Europe, you see a lot of cases where you get over 25% resistance. And then in Acetonano Acinetobacter baumannii, sorry, you end up with resistance to carbapenems. Basically, across the world, you have large parts where you're getting towards 70, 80% resistance in isolates, which is also pretty scary given these are last line treatments to one of the most deadly bugs that we know of. This is top critical pathogen on the WHO priority pathogen list. So pretty scary outlook there. So with the ARMoR, we focus on two areas. One is on reinvigorating the antimicrobial R&D pipeline, and the other is ensuring access to both new and existing drugs in low and middle income countries. So as we're seeing this sort of increase of resistance globally, we need new drugs that are coming online that are capable of treating these increasingly resistant infections. But what we see in reality is that since the sort of golden age of discovery of antibiotics and antimicrobials in the 40s to the 60s, we're seeing a sharp drop off in the number of new classes of drugs that are coming online. There's been something like an 81% decline in new antibiotics developed in the last 30 years. This date is till 2012, but it's not got any better really since then. Had maybe one or two approvals of drugs that have real use cases. And if we compare this to oncology, this number is now slightly updated. This is something like 65 antibiotics in clinical development, but versus over 1,000 in oncology. So essentially what we're seeing is increasing number of infections and complete collapse of the pipeline that we need for new drugs that are capable of treating them. Adding to this, only two of those drugs actually treat the most critical gram-negative infections. So really, we're just not seeing enough drugs come online. The reason for this is that essentially it's really, really hard to make money from antimicrobials, and this has led to a mass exodus of big pharmaceutical companies from the space. So AstraZeneca, where I used to work, have a really strong legacy in antibiotics, but in 2016 they sold off their entire business unit to Pfizer, basically owing to the fact that you you end up spending something like $1 billion developing a new drug, and then the annual sales that you expect from that drug are something in the $50 million per year region. So you even when you have a drug on market, you're basically looking at an asset which is not going to make you very much money. Compare that to oncology. One of the drugs I used to work on at AstraZeneca was raking in something like $5 billion a year. So it's kind of if you do the simple economics, it's not that hard to see why people have left the space. If we look at this graph on the right, you can see how much the venture capital space is really just not fulfilling the need for new antibiotics. So there's been this wild spike in oncology investment, up to something like $7 billion of VC just in the US in 2020, whereas in antibiotics, it floats around hundreds to 200 million, which is just not nearly enough to develop the drugs that we need. The reason for not being able to make money is kind of several folds, but essentially it is that you when you get an antibiotic, you prescribe it for as short course as possible. Whereas if you are on something like an oncology medicine or a cardiovascular medicine, you can be on it for the rest of your life. So it's much easier for companies to justify high price tags. We also typically approve antibiotics on non-inferiority trials. So that essentially means all we've shown is that it's the same as the generic that it's comparing against. So governments typically and private insurers use that to drive the price down of the drug. And then finally, in high-income countries, we still have a relatively low burden of highly drug-resistant infections. So there aren't that many use cases for it. You maybe have a few thousand infections in the UK, for example, every year that would need a new drug. So all this leads to a market which is just completely unviable for these essential medical products. Pictorially, you can see as we're investing in the drug, as you go through basic research and clinical development, you can be sinking $1-2 billion into it, and then by the time we get onto market, you're making really small revenue every year with this huge gap that's needed to actually pay you back for the development and encourage others to spend more money in the space. So what we think you need to do about this is what we call push and pull incentives. So push incentives or push funding is where governments and philanthropy come in during clinical development and preclinical and effectively fund parts of the development themselves. That happens quite a lot. We see a reasonable amount of push funding. And then what we specifically work on is this concept called pull incentives, which some of you might have heard a recent 80,000 Hours podcast on this. But essentially, it's where you say, if you manage to develop a drug that meets these requirements and you bring it to market, then we will guarantee you this payout. And that's really necessary to sort of repair the market, encourage development, but also ensure once the drug gets made that it actually gets to everyone who needs it. You can tie the pull incentive to, for example, in the EU pull incentive we're working on, you can tie it to registering and access in every single country in the EU. So you can use it to kind of set up the market in the exact way you want. We recently ran some calculations figuring out what the return on investment was likely to be for investing in these types of pull incentives. And we essentially showed that in every single EU country, you get a positive return on investment. And then globally investing in these incentives gives you something like an 125 to 1 return over a 30-year time horizon. So they're a fantastic investment, but getting governments to actually do it is challenging, and I'll come on to that shortly. What this will look like is as you're developing the product, you get push support from companies like these guys, or initiatives like these guys, and I'll come on to a bit about what they do in a second. You maybe get you maybe get regulatory relief, which means that you have the regulator would maybe support you more than they would with other drugs. They would maybe waive fees, and this essentially means you have to spend less money. Then when you get onto market, you would get, well, our ideal mechanism is what we call a subscription model. And this is essentially where every year, regardless of the amount of drug you actually sell, you get a fixed price. So it's sometimes called a Netflix model. So regardless of the amount that you actually pay or the use of Netflix, you always pay a fixed rate. We think that that's what people should be doing for antimicrobials as well. So for say 10 years, you get this fixed payment per year, regardless of the sales volume. So far, in on the push side of things, we have some big global initiatives, particularly the US through their BARDA program, which is part of their National Institute of Health, funds a lot of early stage and late stage clinical development. Um, there's quite a lot of global public-private partnerships, such as CARB-X or GARD-P, who will invest in these products through non-dilutive funding or through partnerships. GARD-P in particular will partner with groups who are developing antimicrobial, and they'll take the asset and maybe run a clinical trial in a low resource setting, which a small biotech in Europe wouldn't be able to afford to do. Um, and they'll also give funding and support to run trials yourselves. The AMR Action Fund is a group that private industry set up, and they have something like $1 billion to invest in antimicrobial development. And they're seen as sort of a sticking plaster until we manage to get the market sorted. And they basically invest in companies. And then Secure, which is an initiative that we work quite a lot on, is basically looking at creating more intelligent procurement systems in low and middle income countries to help improve access to antimicrobials and generally help shape the market, kind of like a global fund or a Gavi for antibiotics, but with far, far less money. Um, on the pull incentive side, I'm not going to run you through everything, but essentially there's a lot of countries looking at different models that could be used to help secure the market and improve it. Um, we have a couple of notable ones in the UK. We have this subscription model that I mentioned, which will see countries pay up to £20 million per year per drug, for the entire patent life of that drug, so up to 15 years. We think this roughly represents how much the UK should be paying to, and that if it was scaled up to all high-income countries, would represent a solid market for antimicrobials and would act as an incentive for people to put more investment into the space. In Switzerland, where you guys are, there is a proposal to do the exact same thing as the UK, which is currently being worked through the parliament. And then other country, the other notable one that we really need to get on board is what's called the PASTOR Act in the US, which would essentially see them set up something very similar to the UK. As I mentioned, beyond the need to innovate new drugs, there's a need to improve global access to these drugs. So something like, of the last 18 drugs to come to market, or antimicrobials to come to market, only two have become available in all markets in the G7 and high-income countries in the EU. So if we can't get them to those kind of countries, then we have very little chance of getting them to places around the world. This is particularly important because 90% of the direct deaths caused by AMR occur in low middle income countries, and 99% of the deaths under 5 occur in low middle income countries. And as you can see from this graph, with the amount of green on it, all of these countries are sub-Saharan Africa that have the highest burden, followed by Southeast Asia. So a real need to improve the global access map as well. The way we think this should be done, or in on top of these subscription models and other pool incentives that I mentioned, we think there should be really strong clauses in pool incentives, which basically say that if you are getting this money, then you, as the company, have to support global access and stewardship. So essentially, we're saying that if we give you large payouts for not making that much of the drug, then you should have to license your drug to someone else to help supply it in low and middle income countries, or you should have to supply it at affordable prices yourself. And you would basically tie that in as a contractual clause into the pill incentive. Beyond that, it's not just enough to have the drug in these countries. You often need to understand how to use it. So we think that there needs to be increased support for infrastructure, um, and that these pull incentives should basically be looking at drugs which aren't just relevant in high income countries, but also which meet high global health need. And then, as I mentioned, initiatives like Secure through GARP, which use procurement tools like pooled procurement or revenue guarantees to improve access in low middle income countries are super important. So that kind of wraps up what's going on in the landscape and what we want to see happen. So I'll now quickly run you through what we're trying to do and how we're trying to achieve this. Um, so this is our theory of change as an organization. What we essentially spend our days doing is building up a portfolio of advocacy materials to show to civil servants and politicians why this is really, really important. So this could be anything from economic analysis to surveys of the population, showing how important they think it is, to speaking with medical professionals and getting them to sign statements saying, yes, this is something we see in our hospitals and we would want you to use these mechanisms to get us new drugs. So we effectively build up like several outputs that we can feed into policymakers to try and persuade them that this is something they need to do. On top of that, we work on actually designing these policies. So I know way more about EU procurement mechanisms than I ever thought I would now, because we want to be able to say not just that you should do this broad idea, but also this is a viable way for you to get to it. So we spend a lot of time actually looking at what those policies should be and how we want them to work. And then essentially me doing this from my bedroom in Macclesfield in England alongside a couple of other people around the world is not going to be able to push it through, regardless of how good our ideas are, regardless of how good our policy is and our evidence base is. So we engage with lots of other stakeholders in the space, whether that be industry or other NGOs, civil society organizations, groups like cancer patient organizations, and trying to show why this is super important for oncology as well. And we basically build a network of stakeholders who all support the kind of things that we want. We try and use this to get stakeholders, mainly civil servants and politicians in target countries, to support our asks. So this is the sort of technocratic lobbying and actually I spend a lot of time in Brussels, basically trying to talk to policymakers there and persuade them this is something that we think they should do. And then what we hope this does is that we get in place suitable pull incentive policies which bring through drugs which meet high unmet need globally. And then they also contain these clauses to do with access that mean that they get these drugs to other parts of the world. From this, we hope that it means that new antimicrobials get developed and brought to market because of the incentives that are now there for people to invest in them, and that they get to people in high income countries and low middle income countries, ultimately resulting in reduced death and morbidity from AMR. Going into a bit more detail of those inputs and hopefully giving you a flavor of what policy work actually looks like in this space. So within our advocacy portfolio, as I mentioned, we do economic analysis. That's probably been our most successful area to date. We also look at, for individual countries, what's the burden level like? What does that actually mean for them? What's the projections of how bad the burden could get? We might highlight case studies of outbreaks to people. So, for example, in Italy, there was an outbreak of I think it's called highly virulent carbapenem-resistant Klebsiella pneumoniae. And that's something we use to sort of try and scare policymakers into action there. We try and build support from civil society, and we've also recently completed what we're calling compliance assessments. So we've basically looked at all the G7 countries, the commitments they've made on AMR, and then how much they've actually lived up to those to essentially try and hold them accountable. We've designed policies, so we've got a guidebook which shows countries how they could actually implement these policies because they're not super straightforward. It does take a bit of understanding, and they're a bit new and a bit weird. So we're trying to help them, like guide them into how they can actually do it. We make trade-offs from our ideal policy to something that we think is implementable and pragmatic. And then beyond this, as I mentioned, we work with a wide group of stakeholders. We're part of a UN quadripartite platform on AMR where we feed in ideas. we spend a lot of time working alongside other AMR organizations, kind of collaborating on advocacy, collaborating on ideas, and then we also engage with politicians a lot on this. Some barriers we've noticed to this are most countries are pretty uncertain about which incentives to use and how much they'll cost, so we try and alleviate that. The antimicrobials in general, people don't understand. A common objection you get is, why should we pay more for this than we have to? So people really don't understand why there's a need to incentivize new drugs or why they should pay more once these drugs are actually developed. You essentially have this issue where as soon as you develop the technology, people want to drive the price down. So we need to overcome that. And then particularly in the EU, there's a big coordination problem. When you speak to EU institutions, they tell you this is a member state thing. When you speak to member states, they tell you it's an EU thing. So trying to make sure that's coordinated in the right way is quite challenging. So far, in terms of traction, we've had quite a lot of cool things. We've, as I mentioned, been in the Parliament and spoke to quite a lot of policymakers about this. We have had interactions with 6 or 7 different member state governments who are interested in developing these policies. And then we've been at quite a lot of big events talking about this, and we've given talks at the AMR conference in Basel. I was just in Philadelphia giving a talk out there at the World AMR Congress. We were also at the UN General Assembly 2 weeks ago in New York, where we were engaging on a lot of this and discussing with policymakers how they could actually push this forward. And we've also produced some quite cool research, which has got quite a lot of traction. So our value add as an organization, or what we think is really useful, is that we focus very specifically on pull incentives and access. So we're not, this is the only thing we do. Most other actors in the space are either industry or they're guys like Médecins Sans Frontières who do focus on this, but have quite a broad portfolio and need to balance it against other things, whereas we just work on this and can basically become quite knowledgeable in the area. We also support with implementation. A lot of organizations kind of say they want new drugs and then get off the bus, whereas we actually get into we think, for example, we think you need to develop this exact procurement mechanism, which will help support new drugs. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, we have a really clear focus on one thing. So lessons we've learned in the last while, we think this is a really high, working on policy in general is potentially a really high leverage position. So we think that with quite a small organization, you can essentially drive a lot of change if you can get it done through this route. You can bring in others, you can offer other larger existing organizations something really interesting that they can do that can contribute to the space. So with quite a small organization, you can potentially have an outsized impact, which we think is really cool. You can run really lean as well compared to, for example, either developing these drugs yourself or being on the ground trying to get them to people. You need to know less than what people might think to start off with this. Early days when I was starting this, I was very nervous about the fact that I wasn't a policy guy and I didn't really know anything about that. But what became quite clear quite quickly is that if you spend a year looking at something really, really niche, you can become a real expert in it, even if you don't know the wider space. Generally, when you come along with these ideas, people want to help. At least in AMR, people have been super open to us coming along. And we've used a lot of volunteers since starting out and found that they're generally quite an underutilized resource. So we think that they can be leveraged a lot more. So quickly, getting started in policy, I think there's a lot you can do. Even if you're working in something else, if this is something that is of interest to you, you can essentially just start writing policy proposals, doing research, and then sending it to people first reach out, get feedback and criticism on what you're doing. But you can essentially just write a policy brief in 2 or 3 pages and then send it out to political parties or civil servants and basically try and get a discussion started. We obviously are doing this under an organization, but essentially we are 3 or 4 people who are interested in this and have managed to push quite far into policy development just by creating ideas and sharing them around. The other thing with policy is the space for change is absolutely massive. You can do everything from developing up policies, doing economic analysis, really getting into the detail as we do, through to organizing protests, through to you could just go and chain yourself to Ursula von der Leyen's car and demand she does something. Like the space is absolutely huge that you can explore. So have a look at that and figure out what is best for you to do within your area. Um, you can find champions such as MPs who have spoken about and care about this issue. That's something we're doing just now. We're looking to build groups of them together. And then another thing you have to do is be politely persistent. So once you've sent your ideas and sent your plans to people, they're very unlikely to just say this is the greatest thing ever and implement it straight away. So you need to kind of push a bit and be willing to kind of feel a bit uncomfortable by constantly going back to someone and asking them to do what they've said they'll do. But essentially, I think you can just get started and learn as you go. There's a lot to be gained from just kind of getting something out there and starting pushing for it. On the other hand, some reasons to think that policy sucks. It doesn't feel as impactful as being on the ground, actually doing things. I was at a charity entrepreneurship event a few months ago where everyone was talking about the fact that they have got medicine to 20,000 people in northern Nigeria, or they have vaccinated so many people in India. And the best I'm ever going to be able to say is that I have a piece of paper which says the thing I want. And that just doesn't have the same sort of warm fuzzies that working directly with things that with either in hospital or working on the ground or developing something for yourself, which can be really hard. So you need to kind of keep that in mind. It can be really hard to see progress, and even when you do see progress, you don't know if it was you don't know if it was going to happen anyway. So you need to kind of quite accurately track what you're doing and where you think you've actually managed to make success. There's always the question of will this just happen anyway? Like you're not party to all the discussions that are going on in this space, so that's kind of hard to get over. And then you can also have the issue that no one is listening to you. Like I'm completely unaware if when I log off a call with a policymaker in whichever country we're working in, if they just stop and laugh at me, or if they're just like, oh yeah, that guy spent ages on that and we're never going to do it, or if they go away being like, yeah, that was really interesting. Let's push that ahead. Um, the other thing which is quite frustrating is you think you have great ideas, you think they're really necessary, you think the evidence base exists, and people just aren't doing it. You don't understand what their objections are. So it takes quite a lot of resilience in that way to push on through and believe in what you're doing. Um, I'll stop there, but happy to have a bit of a discussion on any of this. If anyone's interested in being involved and learning about this, then we have lots of opportunities to work with us, and we also have lots of within charity entrepreneurship. We have lots of policy organizations who I'm sure would love to get input and help you learn about the space and also help them with some of the stuff that they're pushing forward. So hopefully that gave you a bit of an intro to what we're doing, why we think policy is really cool. And if anyone is interested in the space, I'm very happy to have a follow-up chat. But thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. Now